G'day, welcome to my channel, where I focus on Australian true crime. I'm Lauryl Kathleen, and this is my second long form video, so bear with me. Hopefully she goes alright. Thanks for being here and listening, I appreciate you. Let's get into today's case. Before Toyah Cordingley's name became tied to one of Queensland's most painful investigations, she was simply Toyah, a young woman whose life was shaped by kindness, gentleness, and a deep love for animals. That's the part of her story that people who knew her hold on to most tightly. She wasn't defined by what happened to her, she was defined by who she was. Warm, compassionate, soft-spoken, and someone who moves through the world with a calm presence that made others feel at ease. Toyah lived in Cairns, a place where the ocean and the rainforest sit side by side, and where people tend to drift towards a slower, more grounded way of living. She was working at Whole Life Pharmacy and Health Foods in Earlville. That put her in contact with people every day, and she approached those interactions with care. Co-workers talk about how she remembered little details about customers. Friends talk about how she never made a big deal out of helping others. She just did it. And her family remembers her as someone who filled their home with warmth simply by being herself. A big part of Toyah's life revolved around animals. She had worked at Paws and Claws Refuge and Boarding Centre in Port Douglas. She was on a different level with animals. Even the troubled dogs would calm down in her presence. Animals trusted her, and humans did too. Even when she no longer worked there, she continued to volunteer there. It was one of those threads that connected her to the world around her. On October 21st, 2018, Toyah took her dog Indy for a walk at Wangari Beach, a secluded stretch of coastline between Cairns and Port Douglas. It was a warm Sunday afternoon, the kind of day where the sunlight feels soft and the sea breeze moves gently through the trees. The kind of day that practically invites you outside. For Toyah, going to Wangari wasn't unusual. It was familiar, peaceful, a place where she could enjoy some time in nature with Indy trotting happily beside her. There was nothing unusual or worrying about her plans, nothing that hinted at danger. It was meant to just be an ordinary afternoon. She parked her car near the little gravel pull-offs beside the highway, took Indy's leash, and headed towards the sand. But when evening came and she didn't return home, her family felt something shift inside them. Quiet alarm at first, the kind that comes when someone is late without explanation. But that concern deeply quickened because Toyah wasn't someone who disappeared without calling. She was consistent, thoughtful, reliable. And then came the moment that made everything feel wrong. Indy was found alone near the beach access, confused and without Toyah. Toyah would never have abandoned Indy. Something was terribly wrong. Her family didn't wait for morning. They grabbed torches and hurried to Wangari Beach, calling her name into the darkness. Friends joined them, volunteers joined. Even people who didn't know Toyah came out because the fear of a missing young woman struck something deep in the community. They searched for hours across sand, scrub, and dunes, refusing to stop even when exhaustion began to settle in. At first light on the 22nd of October, Toyah's father returned to the area, and in the dunes behind the beach, he found her. There are no words strong enough to describe that moment. For the family, for the community, for anyone who heard the news, it was devastating. It changed the course of countless lives in a single instant. The peaceful beach, once a place of quiet beauty, now felt heavy, marked forever by that loss. Police arrived quickly and began treating the site with enormous care and seriousness. They cordoned off the area. Forensic teams examined the sand, the vegetation, every possible trace left behind. What had been an ordinary Sunday now became the centre of a major investigation and one of the most emotionally charged cases far north Queensland had ever witnessed. The first days of the investigation were intense and meticulous. Officers spoke with passers-by, beachgoers, locals. They reviewed CCTV from towns up and down the coastline. They collected digital data, searched through phone records, and built a timeline of Toyah's final moments. They asked the public for dashcam footage from that stretch of highway, hoping someone had captured something they hadn't noticed at the time. As investigators dug deeper into Toyah's final hours, the case took on an intensity that matched the emotional weight felt across far north Queensland. Police worked quietly but tirelessly, combing through every detail that might bring clarity. They analysed phone data, tracked digital footprints, interviewed anyone who had been anywhere near Wangari Beach that day, and carefully reconstructed Toyah's movements from the moment she left home. As they began to piece together the timeline, one detail emerged that shifted everything, something that at first seemed small but quickly revealed itself. A man living and working in Cairns region, Rajwinder Singh, had abruptly left Australia the morning after Toyah's body was found. He didn't clean out his work locker, he didn't retrieve his belongings, he left behind his personal mobile, and he didn't tell anyone he was going. It was unusual, unsettling even. People don't typically vanish from their jobs overnight without an explanation. They don't abandon their phones, their routines, their entire lives unless something has gone very wrong. Investigators didn't jump to conclusions, but they also didn't dismiss the red flags. Quietly, they began focusing more closely on Singh. They reviewed footage of his moments in the days leading up to Toyah's disappearance. They looked at his work logs, his financial activity, his travel bookings, and his interactions with people around him. The more they looked, the harder it became to ignore the timing of his departure. Still focusing on a person of interest is not the same as proving involvement. Investigations have to move carefully, especially when they may cross borders. Evidence must be solid. Timelines must align, processes must be thorough. So while the community waited anxiously for answers, police continued building the case with deliberate patience. A rushed conclusion helps no one, especially in cases where the path of justice may stretch across international legal systems. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the initial shock of the Cairns community deepened into something more complicated. Grief mixed with fear, hope mixed with uncertainty. People attended vigils, laid flowers, lit candles, and reached out to Toyah's family in quiet, heartfelt ways. The community held on to each other because they didn't know what else to do. They had lost a young woman who had represented kindness, warmth, and gentleness, and they wanted her story to matter. Toyah's family carried themselves through this period with strength that seemed almost superhuman. They met with investigators, they spoke publicly when needed, they allowed their plan to be visible without letting it consume them. And through it all, they kept reminding everyone who Toyah was. Not a victim, not a headline, but a person with a full, beautiful life that had been taken far too soon. Meanwhile, police continued their work behind the scenes. They collaborated with the Australian Federal Police. They began the difficult process of international communication with authorities in India. Locating someone in another country, someone who doesn't want to be found, is extraordinarily challenging. India is vast, with millions of people, constantly moving populations, and regions where formal documentation may be limited. Even when authorities want to help, the process is never simple. Years passed, birthdays, anniversaries, family milestones marked by absence. But the investigation did not stop. Evidence was maintained, leads were pursued, files were updated. The case remained active, even if publicly it seemed quiet. Then in November 2022, everything changed again. The Queensland government announced a historical $1 million award, the largest ever offered in the state, for information leading to Singh's capture overseas. It was a turning point, not just legally, but emotionally. It signaled that the case was not forgotten, that the system had not slowed down, that the search for justice was still alive. The reward made headlines across India. Toyah's photo was shown on news stations thousands of kilometres from the beach where she took her final walk. Awareness spread rapidly, reaching new regions and new communities. Suddenly, people who had never heard her name were filing tips, making calls, sharing information. And then after 4 long years, the breakthrough arrived. Indian authorities located Singh in Delhi and arrested him. The news sent a shockwave of emotion through Cairns. Relief, disbelief, grief resurfacing all at once. Toyah's family had waited so long, endured so much uncertainty, and now finally there was movement. Not closure, but progress. A step toward the truth. But even with the arrest, the journey was far from over. International extradition is slow, complex, laid with legal requirements, court hearings, documentation exchanges, and diplomatic procedures. Yet for the first time since 2018, Toyah's family could see a path forward. It wasn't a short path, it wasn't an easy one, but it was finally, undeniably, moving. And that's where the next part of this story begins. Singh's arrest in Delhi was a breakthrough, but it wasn't the end. It was in many ways the beginning of another long and emotionally draining chapter. When news broke across Australia that he'd been detained, people felt a surge of something they hadn't allowed themselves to feel in a long time. Cautious hope. Not celebration, but a quiet belief that the long search for justice might finally be gaining traction. For Toyah's family, the moment must have been overwhelming. Relief and grief often sit side by side in cases like this. On one hand, there was progress, concrete progress, after 4 painful years. On the other hand, the reality surfaced. The reason this arrest mattered was because their daughter was gone. No amount of progress could soften that truth. But still, there was movement, and that mattered. The extradition process began almost immediately. Australian authorities initiated formal requests. Indian courts held hearings. Lawyers presented documents. Judges reviewed the case files that had been meticulously built over years of patient investigation. It was a slow procedural march towards bringing Singh back to Queensland, and every step required precision. Extradition is never simple. It involves not just law, but diplomacy, timing, and cultural expectation. It requires alignment between two countries with different systems, different pressures, and different legal frameworks. And in this case, it was unfolding under the weight of public attention and families' long-held grief. Months passed, hearings were adjourned, rescheduled, heard again. Each update came in fragments. A small headline here, a news bulletin there, and throughout it all, Toyah's family showed extraordinary endurance. They waited, they listened, they remained present. The strength they carried through this part of the process was as powerful as their determination in the early days of the investigation. Finally, after lengthy proceedings, extradition was approved. Australian federal police officers flew to India to escort Singh back to Queensland. It was a moment heavy with significance. After years of searching, years of uncertainty, the man accused of taking Toyah's life was once again on Australian soil. From the outside, the news seemed sudden. One day he was in Delhi, and the next he was stepping off a plane surrounded by officers. But for those who had lived the case day by day, it wasn't sudden at all. It was the result of years of collective effort from investigators, diplomats, legal teams, and a family who never gave up. When Singh arrived back in Queensland, the case had shifted into a phase that felt both familiar and daunting: the legal process. Court appearances began, papers were filed, evidence was compiled into formal submissions. The story of Toyah's final day, and everything learned since, now had to be told in a courtroom, carefully, factually, respectfully. Toyah's family attended the proceedings with the same quiet dignity they had shown since the beginning. They sat through hearings, listened to procedural language, watched as lawyers went back and forth over details that, to them, were not abstract points of law but pieces of personal nightmare. Their presence alone was a form of strength, a reminder that this wasn't just a case, but a daughter, a life, a family changed forever. Then came the trial. Courtrooms have a stillness to them, especially in cases like this. People sit straighter, voices soften, every word is measured, and in that space, Toyah's story was laid out in full. Her last known movements, the discovery at Wangari Beach, the evidence collected over years, and the timeline that investigators had worked so hard to piece together. Forensic experts testified. Detectives walked the jury through the investigation. Digital analysis explained phone records, location data, and travel patterns. Witnesses described what they remembered from that day in 2018. Some spoke confidently, others hesitated, afraid of misremembering something so important. All of it mattered. All of it contributed to the broader picture. And as each piece of evidence was presented, the emotional cost was viable on the faces of Toyah's family. Not in dramatic outbursts, they were far too composed for that, but in a quiet, exhausted weight that settles into a person's posture when they've been carrying grief for far too long. The defense presented their arguments as well. They questioned the interpretation of evidence, they tested the prosecution's timeline, they encouraged the jury to consider alternative explanations. That is how the system works. A fair trial requires every angle to be examined. But for the family watching, it was painful. Necessary, but painful. Days passed, testimonies accumulated, arguments were shaped carefully and deliberately. The courtroom became a place where time felt slow, where each new detail laid onto the ones before it, and when both sides finally rested their cases, the responsibility shifted to the jury. Their deliberation carried enormous weight, not just legally, but emotionally. People waited anxiously inside and outside the courtroom. Toyah's family held on to each other, the community held its breath. Then at last, the jury returned. With their return came the moment that would define the chapter of this long, heartbreaking story. When the jury returned to the courtroom, the air changed in a way that everyone felt, but no one spoke aloud. Moments like this don't need explanation, people simply know. The jurors' faces were solemn, their steps measured. They took their seats with the quiet understanding that the words they were about to speak would carry immense weight for a family who had waited years to this day. When the judge asked whether a verdict had been reached, the foreperson stood and answered with a steady voice, "Yes." And then came the words that Toyah's loved ones had been holding their breath for, "Guilty." It wasn't a moment of celebration, it wasn't triumph or loud, it was instead a release of breath, a soft collapse of years of tension, a recognition that the truth had finally been spoken in a room where every word matters. Toyah's family held on to each other gently, some tears fell quietly, some people simply closed their eyes and let the moment settle over them. Justice in its solemn heavy way had arrived. The conviction didn't erase the pain, it didn't bring Toyah back, but it did bring clarity, validation, and a sense of honoring the truth of what happened. It allowed the family and the community to finally move out of the long suspended space of waiting and into the space where healing, however complicated, could begin. Sentencing came next. The judge spoke carefully, acknowledging the seriousness of the crime, the immeasurable impact on Toyah's family, and the years of work by investigators across continents. The sentence, life imprisonment with a 25-year non-parole period, reflected the gravity of the loss and the need for accountability. Again, the courtroom didn't erupt. Instead, there was a quiet, steady understanding that the legal process had done what it could. Toyah's parents, with extraordinary composure, thanked those who had supported them, from investigators to community members to strangers who simply refused to let the story fade. Their strength in this moment mirrored the strength they had shown from the first day Toyah went missing. They carried themselves with the kind of dignity that leaves an impression on everyone who witnesses it. Outside the courtroom, Cairns reacted, not with noise, but with compassion. People who had followed the case from the very beginning felt a deep emotional shift, not joy, but a kind of communal exhale. Messages of support poured out, small gestures of kindness appeared in places connected to Toyah's memory. Her favorite beach spots were visited by people who wanted to sit in quiet reflection. Flowers were placed at vigils, conversations among neighbors carried a tone of tenderness. The community that had been grieving for years allowed itself to finally feel something close to resolution. But even with the verdict and sentence, grief remains what it had always been, a companion that stays longer after courtrooms empty and headlines fade. For Toyah's family, healing is not about forgetting, it's about learning to live alongside a loss that can never be undone. It's about celebrating who she was, not just remembering the tragedy, but remembering the brightness she brought into the world. And Toyah did bring brightness. People remember her laugh, her gentleness, her love for animals, her willingness to help anyone who needed it. These memories, shared in kitchens, living rooms, workplaces, and quiet moments alone, are what keep her spirit alive. They are what allow her to be remembered as a whole person, not a victim, not a name in a headline, but a daughter, a friend, a young woman with a full heart. Her story has also become a symbol of perseverance. Investigators who worked on her case for years speak about the determination it required, the endless reviews of evidence, the international coordination, the refusal to give up even when the path felt uncertain. Toyah's family's unwavering presence kept the case alive in the public consciousness. Their strength pushed the investigation forward again and again. In the broader community, Toyah's story created a rippling awareness and compassion and resilience. It highlighted how deeply people can care for someone they've never met, how communities rally around families in grief, and how a single life can leave an imprint that extends far beyond its years. Even now, Toyah inspires acts of kindness, volunteer efforts, and moments of reflection in people who want to honor her memory. As time moves on, her name remains intertwined with love. She is remembered in gentle ways she lived, through her connection with animals, her tenderness with others, her warm presence that made people feel known. The tragedy of her loss will always be there, but so too will the beauty of who she was. And that is where her story rests now, not only in court records or reports, but in the hearts of people who continue to carry her memory. A family still grieving, a community forever changed, and a young woman whose life, though cut tragically short, continues to be remembered with love, compassion, and an ache that speaks to how deeply she mattered. And that was the case of Toyah Cordingley. Thanks for watching, guys. like, subscribe. I'll see you next time.